Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between John Edwards and Chris Manning.
All right, a little bit of follow-up from our last episode when we were talking about some of our goals and how we decide on the things that we want to work on. So shortly after we recorded that episode, one of our favorite podcasts that both of us listened to, Cortex, dealt with some of the similar ideas of goal setting. But they had a slightly different take on it that I liked. Instead of talking about specific goals, Gray and Mike were talking about yearly themes and how the theme sort of drives what they do in a year. I think it's worth listening to if you enjoyed that part of our show. I do like the idea of getting away from a specific goal and sort of focusing on that theme, because the theme can then drive you towards different things that you may not have thought about early on in the year, and is maybe a little bit more forgiving in some ways. And when I gave it some thought, I think the themes that I'm going to have for 2018 are going to be sharing knowledge and timekeeping. So I think that's what I'm focusing on for 2018.
Riffing off last episode, I have to say mine would just be tying up loose ends.
Now, we've had a few people who've contacted us since the episode where I talked about purchasing movements from Eterna, and a few people who've asked about pricing. And I wanted to address it a little bit. The pricing is a bit difficult to talk about for a few reasons. The first is that Eterna doesn't make their pricing public, and I'm a little bit hesitant to share specific details of that pricing publicly, just because they're not sharing that information publicly. But above and beyond that, it's a little bit different than buying a lot of things that people are used to. When you're purchasing these movements, there are a lot of different options available to you, not just in terms of the complications, but there's also differences in pricing based on the type of Geneva stripes, for instance, that you get on the piece, or not having Geneva stripes on the piece. Also, different types of plating options that are available to you. Obviously, the volume of units that you're buying, things of that nature. It's a bit difficult to give specifics about it because, again, it changes so dramatically. You can obviously change the price quite a bit based on the different types of finishing that you're getting. And also, they have options for different, for instance, different fonts or different printing on things like the date wheels and whatnot. So there are a lot of different options available to you when you're doing that. Now, again, their pricing isn't really open to the public because they're not retailers. That's not what they're doing, although they do have a line of watches that they sell, and that information is available on their website if you want to purchase an Eterna watch from them, and that's the obviously cased and dialed and everything like that. But if you're just looking at watch movements, again, they don't really sell to the public like that. However, if you're a watchmaker and you're interested in getting information on it, on their movements, they are definitely open to discussing it, and they've been excellent to deal with. They've been certainly willing to discuss movement prices with me. I'm not a well-known watchmaker by any means. I'm not a large brand. When I was purchasing the initial movements, I was only buying one movement at a time of a couple of different calibers, and they were happy to deal with me. So even small watch brands or watchmakers, they are happy to discuss pricing with you. So if you're in the industry and you're looking to purchase movements for watches, I highly recommend getting in contact with them. They've been excellent to deal with. And then I guess one last bit of follow-up. We have created a few different ways for people to ask questions to us. One is through our email address, hello@offhours.show. The other is using a hashtag on Twitter, hashtag AskOffHours. If you have questions that you want to ask John or I about whatever it is that we do, could be watchmaking, could be just making things in general, development, whatever it happens to be. If you have some questions that you want to pose to us, either of those will get in touch with us. Every few episodes, if we've got some interesting questions, we'll we'll try and put something together and maybe answer those questions if we think there's something interesting to talk about there.
SIHH, the Salon International de Horologerie, happened just a few weeks back. That's the first major industry trade show that has happened since we started recording Off Hours. What do you think of the new releases at SIHH this year?
I always enjoy watching the coverage from these shows. It's and I'm hoping one of these years I get over for one of the shows and be able to see some of the stuff in person. It is a good chance to see some of the trends in the industry and where things are going. And this year in particular, there were a few things that really caught my eye. And there were some watches that definitely attracted my attention and gave me some ideas for design ideas for myself for the future. So yeah, I really enjoyed the coverage this year, and it was interesting seeing some of the trends this year. A few things that I noticed that have changed, and a few things that I'm happy with, a few things that I'm not.
May I ask what weren't you happy with?
There are a few trends that I think are starting to go away a little bit that I'm happy to see, but I think are still a problem. One of the things in particular is women's watches, the design of women's watches. I think there's always going to be a place in ladies' watches for, I guess, pieces that are more jewelry pieces and are not necessarily practical timepieces. And I'm seeing a trend away from, for instance, like jewel encrusted watches, and I'm happy to see that. But I still think that a lot of the watch design that's geared towards women is just too frivolous. And I would love to see some more interesting designs that aren't just, oh, hey, look at this. There's, 1,000 diamonds on this watch, and that's the design aesthetic of it. It would be really nice to see, to see more interesting watches and more interesting watch design geared towards women, or maybe stuff that's geared towards men who want a smaller watch that can also be worn by women. I think it's time to see something a little bit more interesting out of women's watch design than just here's a pile of stones on it.
Yeah, I think Cartier tends to do a pretty good job of delivering feminine pieces that aren't necessarily always encrusted or bejeweled in precious stones. And what are your thoughts on the purple dialed Royal Oak that AP released this year? Would you consider that a woman's timepiece?
Absolutely. I think that there are a lot of women who are wearing watches that are probably being designed for men originally, which is great. But of course, one of the problems with that is the trend in men's watches tends to be these relatively large watches, and that of course is difficult for people with small wrists to pull off. Like Tamara, for instance, cannot pull off a large watch. Her wrists are very small, and I think even something like the Royal Oak would probably be too large for her to pull off on her wrist. So while I know there certainly are people who can pull that off, I think it would be difficult for a lot of people to do. The one I saw that really caught my attention that is geared towards women, and I was a little bit surprised because I think it's a great design, and other than a few diamonds that are on it, I would totally wear this watch myself. Romain Gautier's Insight Micro Rotor. The thing that I found interesting about this watch, first off, they did a men's version of this watch last year, I think it was. This one is identical in size, in case size, to the one that they did last year that was directed towards men. I think it's around a 38 or 39 millimeter case. So I thought that was interesting that they chose not to differentiate the two designs by size, because that's a very common thing. But I love what they've done with this, especially the version with the black mother of pearl. I think it's a very striking design. The micro rotor, again, my only complaint about this watch is that the micro rotor has diamonds on the ladies' version of it, whereas the men's version does not have diamonds on it. I'd love to see this watch with something other than diamonds there, maybe a little bit of engine turning in there, something different. But I think that this watch is gorgeous. It's incredibly striking, and I'd love to see more designs like this where they're more interesting than just a bunch of diamonds on a watch.
Yeah, Romain Gaultier being just a very bespoke brand. I'm sure if you told him you didn't want the diamonds on the micro rotor, he would be more than happy to comply if you're willing to shell out the coin to acquire one of these pieces.
Yeah, at the price that they're at, I'm sure that I'm certainly not going to be in a position that I'm ever going to be able to afford one of these watches, unfortunately. But I'm sure at that price, if you said, "Hey, let's lose the diamonds," they probably would. But but looking at this watch again, I would gladly put this watch on my wrist and wear it. I think this is a gorgeous design. I love the colors that are in it. I love the visual contrast of textures, and yeah, I'm happy to see that.
Another piece that, if I recall correctly, it actually does have a diamond bezel on it, but diamonds aren't really the front and center piece, and there might be a version of it without the diamonds as well. Cartier had a new piece this year called the Revelation. Something like 900 gold beads sandwiched between two pieces of sapphire, with a sapphire image of the Cartier Panther in the crystal. It's a very unique piece for women, where if you tilt the watch and play with it back and forth, the gold beads will fill in the visage of their panther and then slowly disappear and trickle down. It's the way the beads would falling through, say, an hourglass.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't seen that piece when I was looking through. That's a great idea. I like that design.
Yeah, very unique. But it's got the price tag to match.
Yes, unfortunately, something people will realize when they start looking through some of these watches is that none of these are inexpensive watches, and I will not be wearing any of these watches anytime soon, unfortunately. It's one of the reasons why I make pens, and one of the reasons why I'm making watches is that I can't afford many of the watches and pens that I want, so I'm making the things that I want instead.
Well, that's how FP Journe started. So
yeah, that's true. That's true. Now, sticking with Cartier, one of the designs that did catch my attention was the Cartier Santos, and from what I understand, this is a reimagining of an older design watch or an older style of watch that they did many years ago, and I'm a huge fan of what they've done with this. Now, I'm a big fan of sort of the Art Deco era and a lot of the very bold graphic style of that. And this watch is great. I love the squareness of it while still using sort of rounded corners. I love the exposed screws around the bezel and holding the bracelet together. I love so much about this watch. I haven't really been a big fan of a lot of the Cartier design. I find it too jewelry-esque. I tend to prefer watches that are a bit more subtle. But this I love. I love the look of this. I love the graphicness of it, and it just looks great.
Their drive, which I believe they only just introduced in 2016, has a very unique, a very becoming aesthetic to it too. And they, I believe, for the first time, they released it in steel this year at SIHH.
Oh, really?
Which is also it's not round, it's not square, it's not a squircle or a hyperellipse. It's got a unique shape all its own.
Yeah, or a torneau. Yeah. It's not one of the classic shapes, and I think the other classic shape that Cartier tends to do is a rectangle with rounded corners on it, and I've never been a big fan of that. I think that probably works really well for people with small wrists. Being someone with larger wrists, I find that something that's too narrow doesn't look good on me. But this, I think, would look great. I think this is a really nice shape and really nice proportions without being massively large. Now, maybe some of that might be influenced by the fact that I've been wearing an Apple Watch for the last couple of years, and So the square watch aesthetic has become something I'm used to, just because that's what I've been seeing on my wrist for the last few years. But maybe that's what it is. But anyways, I'm a big fan of the way that this design looks.
Another reason I think Cartier has succeeded in making some very feminine pieces, or at least pieces that are targeted more towards the female side of the market without being ostentatious or overly blingy, is that they have a phenomenally talented watchmaker heading up their watchmaking division, who is a woman, Carol Forestier Casapi, who's just a brilliant and very accomplished watchmaker. She first made her name for herself in a watchmaking competition back in the late 90s, where she developed as a student what is effectively the predecessor to the Ulysse Nardin Freak. And she actually went on to work at Ulysse Nardin and help bring that Freak to market. And then has done some similar work at Cartier as well, with things like their Astral Tourbillon and whatnot. But I think having that feminine touch that high up in the company is what has enabled them to bring watches to market that do appeal to more of a female clientele.
There was an interview with one of the CEOs of the large brands, and I want to say that it was Patek, but I can't remember now for sure. And he had brought his wife in, who had worked as a designer in fashion before, to work on some women's watches for the brand, because he made the good point that not having a small wrist, not being a woman, it's difficult to design without understanding that aesthetic well, and not, it's easy for me to design something that I want to wear because, well, I just have to look at my wrist and imagine what I want, and there's obviously some interest in that, but it's nice to hear that there's a woman heading their design team, and that they're taking advantage of that, because frankly, I think there needs to be more women designing watches for women. I think that's going to be the best way that we get better watches.
I was surprised to learn this year that the massive centerpiece watch that Lange & Söhne makes every year for their booth at SIHH is actually a functional model. I learned that from Jason Heaton, who hosts the Grenado podcast with James Stacy. And it turns out that this is an actual functioning ticking model made primarily in aluminum for obvious reasons of weight. You wouldn't want a 15-foot across case of platinum dangling there in the middle of a booth. It would just be ungodly heavy.
Not to mention expensive.
That too.
Yeah, I have to say I'm a big fan of Lange & Söhne. I like their aesthetics. In fact, in a lot of ways, there's a few German brands, and I like their aesthetic a lot more than some of the Swiss brands, the traditional Swiss brands. And I am a fan of their design. They do tend towards the large side on their cases. They're certainly not. They're not going to be friendly to cuffs, shirt cuffs. That's for sure. That one may be a little bit too large, though. I think they may have gone a bit too far with a 15-foot one, but
definitely going to fail the cuff test.
But seriously, yeah, it's an impressive feat of engineering building this large watch. I'm a fan of the homage that they did, the 1815 that they did for to celebrate Walter Lange's life. Walter Lange passed away last year at SIHH, or at the same time. He wasn't there, but he passed away at the same time, and they did this 1815 homage to him. I like the style of it. Yeah, that huge model that they build is incredibly impressive. I hope to get a chance to see that in person one day.
And their triple split chronograph was also an impressive feat of engineering as well, which they released this year.
The double split is one that I've looked at and thought that would be a really great watch to own at some point, and the triple split just takes that one step further, and it's certainly an impressive feat of engineering they've managed there.
A split chronograph, or rattrapant, for anyone who might not be familiar, is a chronograph, which is essentially like a stopwatch that is integrated with a normal timekeeping watch, wherein as the hands are traveling, there's actually another hand hiding beneath, say your main seconds hand in a regular split chronograph. In a double split, you'll have the minutes mirrored as well, and then in the triple split, which Lang released this year, they're also mirroring the hours with another hand underneath it. And as these hands are traveling around the dial, you can actually measure two events simultaneously. And using a third pusher on the case, you can pause the hands, one set of hands, generally the ones that are running underneath, while the other hands that are superimposed over top continue to track the time. And then when you reset, the hands will fly back together. It's a really neat complication to play with, and actually has a fair bit of utility under the right circumstance.
Yeah, I have an old Swiss pocket watch movement that was orphaned from its case. That's a split chronograph that it needs a little bit of TLC. I'm looking forward to rebuilding that and building a new case for it. It is a pocket watch movement, so it's not going to see a lot of use. I don't have a huge amount of need for a pocket watch in sort of daily wear, but I think it's going to be a fun movement to rebuild and to recase, because we don't see a lot of those split chronographs anymore, and I think it's a really neat, really interesting design sense and really interesting complication as well. As you say, it's practical if you're using it for timing anything.
Mind you, these days they're probably going to use far more sophisticated timing equipment for tracking sporting events and whatnot. But the technical chops that Lang has are very impressive. The finishing as well. Another standout watch in terms of finishing was Voutilainen's 217 QRS. Not the easiest name to remember, but that was his new release this year at SIHH, and that featured an integrated retrograde date. So it uses a hand on the dial to indicate the date, and it's not done in a full circle, but rather in an arc. And as the hand moves around and transitions from the 31st to the 1st of the month, it will just gently make its way back to the 1st, rather than continuing its arc.
I'm always impressed with the work that Kari does and his team. I am a huge fan of his watches, and I always love to see the new pieces that he has out every year. But the finishing on his watches is second to none, and his complications are fascinating. I like to see what he does with his stuff, and he's always one of the very first watchmakers that I look up whenever there's a new show, so that I can see what he's released, because he is always doing interesting work, and it's always worth checking out.
And it just epitomizes craft.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's nice to see someone who is still independent and doing fascinating work. They're not producing a lot of watches. I remember hearing roughly how many watches they produce a year, and it's not. I don't think it's 1,000 watches a year, the team that's there, but they're doing fascinating work, and it's all at the highest level. So I love seeing that he's managed to maintain his independence from the big brands and still be able to produce these gorgeous watches every year.
Yeah, and part of maintaining that independence has required him to bring more and more of the work in-house. For a long time, he was having dials made by Vauchot, who also supplied Parmigiani Fleurier, where Voutilainen got a lot of his early training working under some of the master watchmakers. Being a small brand, it's hard to get high-quality dials ahead of the bigger groups who are willing to pay more and to throw their weight around. So he actually bought up a dial manufacturer a couple of years ago and has brought all of that in-house. So the engine turning that he's able to create and to pump out is incredible. And he's actually in the position now where he is supplying other makers, not just for his own watches, because he's got enough capacity there within his own brand that he's actually able to do work for brands beyond just his own watches.
Well, that certainly makes sense, and I know for myself, going down this path and looking to see what I can make versus what I can get done, having the ability to do this stuff in house is very liberating, and it is challenging trying to find people who are willing to do high quality work for you if they're, if you're looking outside of your own shop to do it. So I can appreciate that that he's done that. And his engine turn dials are gorgeous. I'm a huge fan. Being an engine turner, I'm a huge fan. I certainly look at his dials as inspiration for some of the work that I'm looking at doing. So yeah, it's nice to hear that that he's managed to do that, and that he's managed to expand the business to be able to do work for other people as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've got nothing but the highest praise for Voutilanen's work. So another interesting bit of engine turning I've noticed recently, and this isn't something new to SIHH 2018, but Montblanc has taken their logo and actually turned that into an engine turning profile or motif, and they've done some neat things with that in a number of their watches. I believe it's, I don't know for certain, but I think it's Villeray, which Montblanc also owns, that does their engine turning work for them. Quite a neat look. Definitely a look I've not seen on any other brand, for good reason, being that it is their logo. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that, given your expertise in the area.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the 4810, which seems to be the dial they've done this on. And it's a great look. I also like the fact they've chosen to offset the center of the pattern. So this is something, if you're taking a look at this watch, this is done on a rose engine. And they've created a custom rosette for that rose engine to be able to do this work. This is certainly not something that you're ever going to find on somebody else's engine. Unless they do work specifically for Montblanc, because this is not a typical pattern. But I think that the choice of, well, first off, their logo I think works well for this kind of work. One of my big complaints about engine turning on watches is people tend to focus around the center of the dial because it's very easy to set up. You can put it into a chuck and it's automatically centered at the center of the dial where the hands are, and it's very, very easy to do that work. And I think it's kind of lazy of most engine turners to do that. There's certainly a time and a place for it, and there's certain elements that definitely work best if they happen to be concentric with that center. But I think too many people sort of work from that center and never experiment beyond that. So I like seeing this. The version I'm looking at is a tourbillon movement, and they've got the tourbillon exposed at the 6 o'clock position, and that's what they've chosen to center their pattern on. And that's a great design choice. They've also chosen not to engine turn the entire dial. Some of it is at a lower, sort of the lower third, I guess, is another plate down below that's been exposed, and you can see the Geneva stripes on that plate instead of the engine turning. So it's nice to see a little bit of contrast there, and the way they've chosen to convert their logo into this pattern is great. I think it works brilliantly, and it, even though it doesn't match up with any of the numbers, any of the hour numbers, for instance, on here, I think it still works well, and I think this is a great use of engine turning that isn't the standard designs that you see with, let's say, a Breguet.
Now moving down market in their line a little bit, I was very surprised by what Montblanc turned out. It's more sporty side of their lineup. Now I know that back in, I think it was 2016, the designer David Serrato, who primarily responsible for bringing Tudor back to more of a prominent position in the market with their heritage line and things like the Black Bay. He worked at Tudor for close to a decade, then moved on. to Mont Blanc, and you can see his fingerprints without question on this new lineup of entry-level Mont Blanc timepieces that are cased in stainless steel. And I was quite impressed with the look of these pieces, as well as the technical chops. I'm not the biggest fan of the fact that they've integrated the mountain into the logo type. It serves its purpose in calling out the sportiness of the watches. I think I would have preferred to see the mountains set just above the logo type, but to each their own. Beyond that, I was just very impressed with the pieces.
Yeah, it is nice to see a brand bringing out a lower end watch. I think that was actually one of the trends I think I saw in this year's watches. A lot of movement sort of down market, and obviously some of these, when I say down market for some of these brands, we're still talking about watches that are extremely expensive. But it was interesting to see a bit of movement down into sub $10,000 watches, for instance, from brands that were rarely doing that. I think Patek ended up releasing a few watches that were in the quote unquote more reasonable category. I think IWC did the same thing. A few of their watches were a little bit more reasonably priced. It is nice to see brands focusing on something that's a little bit more affordable in their line. One watch that we didn't mention is the new Vacheron Constantin Métier d'Art. Their balloon ones, those are gorgeous. I'm a big fan of the Métier d'Art, but this one with the plique à jour enamel work. Plique à jour is a technique that doesn't have any backing behind the enamel, so it's very similar to a stained glass effect. It's extremely challenging to do well because it's a translucent enamel. You fire it onto a temporary substrate like a mica or stainless steel, and then remove it afterwards. It's so difficult to do well. These look absolutely gorgeous. Plus the engraving work that's being done on these balloons. These are the top end of the Vacheron line, and they are gorgeous. I've always been a big fan of the Métier d'Art, but these particular ones are beautiful. Again,
The most impressive execution I've seen in this domain would be on a Kerry Vautier timepiece.
Yeah,
he did a case back using the same technique.
Yeah, it's unbelievably risky to commit to this technique as a in any kind of production sense. I know these are small numbers, but still they're. I can say for myself, I would never commit to doing more than a single watch or a single piece using this technique, just because trying to maintain the consistency between pieces would be so challenging. And hats off to the enamelists that are working there, because these are remarkable pieces.
In a bit of a surprise move, I don't know how much I agree with this, but Vacheron Constantin, in coming down market, released a watch this year that does not adhere to the Poinçon de Genève, the Geneva hallmark on its movement, which I don't know for certain, but I think this may be the first watch they released since that hallmark was instantiated that is not hallmarked by the brand. Waters down the brand a little bit, but I mean it's been a tough few years for a couple of these brands, so there is reason for them to be moving down market a bit. But with Vacheron, there are ways that they could have achieved a lower priced movement without forgoing the Geneva hallmark, and they didn't even do any of the engineering work really. This particular model, they're relying on other brands under the Richemont umbrella. So it just it was disappointing, I guess. I would say. It wasn't very Vacheron Constantin of them. I'll put it that way.
Because they're in that larger group, I wonder how much need is there for that brand to do this.
Precisely.
There are other brands in that group where they could have release this kind of watch, and it would have been more in keeping with the work that they're doing. I can understand if you're an independent of those big groups. If you're somebody like a Rolex, for instance, you need to be able to provide an offering at all different price points for your customers, because you're the only ones providing that within your organization. But inside of these larger groups, I think I don't think it benefits them by sort of muddying which brands are using, or doing what within the group. If you've got that stable of brands available to you, why not maintain the exclusivity and the higher end design and feel of the Vacheron, and let one of the other brands take on the lower end market.
Mm-hmm. And a brand under the umbrella that I think did that quite well this year was Baume & Mercier with their the Clifton Balmatic, which is a 5-day automatic watch that is powered by an entirely in-house caliber of the BM 12-1975A. It's an impressive feat of engineering given the price point for the brand, and given that it was built basically from the ground up. Obviously, you've got a silicone hairspring in there, which is actually quite unique unto itself. I don't know of another brand that has layered two different silicone hairsprings together the way that they have, in order to combat some of the issues that you encounter as far as isochronism is concerned with the hairspring as the power winds down in the watch, which is very important when you've got a 5-day power reserve on a piece. You can have quite a gradient or potential gradient of power coming to the oscillator. So they call it a twin spire technology. That's their marketing term for it. But essentially they print, I guess it's etch, two silicon hairsprings that have different alignments in their crystalline structure, and then they fuse the two together with a silicon dioxide layer that also doubles as a degree of temperature compensation, which also helps improve the isochronism of the piece. So isochronism is essentially just how well a mechanical timepiece is going to keep time over time, or any timepiece really, how well it's going to keep time under varying conditions, which they've done such a good job of that. These are actually chronometer grade movements in these watches, and you can actually request to have the chronometer certificate from COSC for the watch that you purchase, and you can pick one of these up for less than $3,000. So it's impressive. And they've also done a silicon pallet fork and a silicon escape wheel, which means that you don't have to worry about lubrication there, or more particularly lubrication degrading at the escapement over time. So you get a quite long service intervals out of it. And on top of that itself, by virtue of having a silicon hairspring, it also has a free sprung balance, which is also going to give you more stable timekeeping over time. And also, to their credit, I mean, they've been testing this in the lab, they say, for close to 10 years before actually unveiling it, which is much better than what a lot of other brands have done, sort of experimenting on the market. Now, I haven't taken a really, really deep look at the movement, but it appears to use the same Seiko-style magic lever for the automatic winding. So I'm somewhat curious if it shares other traits with some Seiko calibers, because this wouldn't be the first time that a Swiss brand has licensed Seiko technology to very, or not very quickly, but more quickly bring an in-house movement to market. Priced at just under USD $3,000. There's some good value to be had there. Now, a watch that you can get for an order of magnitude less, that I would say give this a run for its money, is Tissot's Powermatic 80, which on the secondary market you can pick up for as little as $350. Another piece that jumped out at me, but is in the realm of the unobtainable, was another of Panerais pieces from their lab program, their R&D arm, It was the L'Astronomo. And what I thought was interesting about this piece was the way that they displayed the sunrise and sunset complications. So this is, as the name suggests, an astronomically oriented timepiece. So it has the equation of time and day-night indication and moon phase and all of that. But nestled in down along the periphery of the dial, around, say, the 7, 8 o'clock area and the 4, 5 o'clock area on the dial, you've got your sunrise and sunset times that are configured to a location on the planet that the purchaser of the watch would request when ordering the piece to have made for them. And it's just a cam-driven system that will, over the course of a year, show you the time that you can expect the sun to rise and the sun to set each day where you've had the watch calibrated for.
Yeah, I saw this watch and I find this watch technically impressive, and like so many watches that Panerai make, it does nothing for me.
I wouldn't wear it, but I like what they've done in terms of the positioning and that it's subtle.
I think the technical side of it is unbelievable. I think the dial is horribly illegible. I can't, every time I look at this, and I'm staring at the photos, I just find it so difficult to see what's going on this dial, and it drives me crazy. I think it's I can't imagine ever wearing this watch, but certainly from a complication point of view, it's impressive what they've done with it. I'm a big fan of these. Same thing with who was it that did was it Van Cleef and Arpels who did the
solar system
orrery? Yes, I'm again never. Well, I could never afford the watch, but regardless, that is a gorgeous, gorgeous idea. I love the execution of it. I love that they've managed to miniaturize an orrery like that into a watch. Yeah, I'm hugely impressed with the technical side of that watch.
It's definitely channeling a bit of steampunk right down to the antiquated loom. But I think their priority there was definitely showing off the mechanism more so than readability. Right down to the fact that they did something really interesting with the date disc, in that it is that the numerals on the disc are laser etched into a piece of borosilicate glass, and they use a polarizing filter over the date aperture. So that only when the disc is situated under the aperture you can read the numbers, and anywhere else it's see-through and lets you peer into the movement and see all that's going on underneath it.
That explains the look of it. I didn't understand why the that date disc looked so odd, and that explains it now. And that's a great way of using a different technology to display something. I find that especially date windows I find horrible for the most part. That's definitely an interesting way of doing it without, because date discs are huge and they take up a huge amount of space in a movement, and they certainly cover up a lot of a movement. And so that's a great way of making the rest of the movement visible through it and not have to compromise on the size of it.
Now, a piece sort of not complete opposite. I mean, it still shares the same family DNA, but a complete flip to this would have been their lab piece that they introduced last year, which was their Lab ID Carbotech, which had a dial that is as black as you can get, blacker than black, if you will. It's just coated in carbon nanotubes that just absorb absolutely every last bit of light that's hitting the dial. So when you stare at it, it's like staring down into an abyss. And Panerai is actually one of the few companies that could pull off using this sort of tech on one of their dials, because they're so well known for their cutout dials that they're able to cut down through the dial, have the luminescent material behind the dial, and then just have that entire dial just blacked out completely. I would hate to have to pull the hands off one of these watches, because you've literally got just a field of carbon nanotubes that you don't want to crush, because if you crush them, it completely ruins the effect of just staring into this deep blackness.
I would love to play with some of that material. I've got some ideas for experimenting with that. Unfortunately, it's difficult to get a hold of, and and license, but I would love to experiment with some of that stuff because, as you say, it is so black and it reflects so little light that there are things you can do with it that allow you to create a contrast there's just no way to ever create otherwise.
Yeah, Vanta Black, I think, is one of the companies that has brought it to market. Two other solutions you could use, though, if you want to experiment it within your pens, is if you're able to get a hold of someone with a femtosecond laser, you can actually finish metal surfaces that are very similar in structure and are able to absorb, well, not absorb so much, but just disperse any light hitting it in such a way that it's not reflected back to your eye. Yeah, trapping the light. And Mother Nature is actually able to deliver a very similar effect from the feathers of the bird of paradise. If you're able to get some of the black feathers from that bird, it has very similar properties to what these carbon nanotubes are doing on the dial of the Panerai Carbotech. And the other really impressive thing about the Carbotech, this was released at SIH last year, was that they are guaranteeing this watch for 50 years and stating that it will not need service at any point during this time period. And that's because the bridges of the movement were made from tantalum carbide, so they don't use any jewels whatsoever in the watch. And the jewels, or what would normally be jewels, are machined directly into the bridges, which are all made from this tantalum carbide, which self-lubricating is not quite the right word, or not an accurate way to describe it. It's more that the coefficient of friction is just so low
that they don't need to lubricate it at all.
Precisely.
Wow. Yeah, that'd be interesting to see. I wonder, if they're going to warranty it properly. That's quite the claim.
Yeah. Well, it does come with an asterisk, so you have to buy the watch and crack the user's manual to see what is and is not covered. But 50-year guarantee is bold. I mean, it comes with an equal price tag to back that, though.
Sure. I'm sure at that price tag they can afford to take the risk on it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's one other watch that I wanted to discuss, and this is the watch. When you look through these, there's always watches like, oh yeah, that'd be really cool. I'd love to own one of those if money was no object. But I think the watch that jumped out at me this year, and if money were no object and I could buy one, I think it would have to be the IWC Pal Weber Digital. This watch, I know it's been polarizing. There are a lot of people who don't like the design of this. So for people who haven't seen this, it has a very bold white enamel dial on it, very stark. The sharp black lines. Well, there's a white and a white version with black lines. There's a white version with blue lines, and there's a blue version with white lines on it. But very, very bold, very, very high contrast look. But the really interesting thing about this is the way the hours and minutes are being displayed on here. They're using discs with numbers on them, and they are digital. So when it moves from 12 to 13, all of a sudden you'll see the disc just change from the 2 to the 3. And so it's not slowly creeping along from one number to another. So it's like it is an old school mechanical digital display. And I love the look of this. The technical side of it is quite impressive. It's actually a double-barreled movement. They needed a separate barrel to power the numbers for the minutes because they are moving so much. Because it has to tick over so many times in the hour. So from a technical point of view, the movement is quite fascinating, and it's an interesting design that they've done. But I love the look of this digital display and that instant tick over. If you get a chance to see a video of it, we'll see if we can find a video to put in the show notes. But it looks great when it moves over. I love that they did this watch. It's not a typical design. It's not typical for their brand either. But I love the look of this watch, and I would, if I could have any watch from SIHH this year, this would be the watch that I'd have. I would wear this every day.
I'd take the Voutilainen.
Okay, I wouldn't turn the Voutilainen down, but this I would never turn down any of Carrie's watches, even some of the ones that I'm not as big a fan of. But this no, this watch I would. I love the look of this. I love the aesthetics of this, and I think it's a great use of sort of classic mechanical technology in a different way that still looks, it's got this great Art Deco feel to it. Yeah, I love the look of this. I also love the fact that they're doing such a bold enamel dial like this. Very few people today are doing great enamel dials anymore, and I think this is probably the best enamel dial I've seen in years, and I love the look of it.
Yeah. No, it's definitely done an admirable job with the tribute to Paul Weber. Another set of enamel dialed watches, which were a bit of a surprise. Omega has taken the opportunity of using the Olympics to sort of tread on this SIHH territory a little bit. They announced a series of Olympic watches right around the time that the show was occurring, and then just recently introduced a series of 3 watches that are effectively the Podium pieces. You've got essentially silver, gold, and bronze. That's actually a white gold, a gold, and more of a rose gold piece. But they've got really nicely done enamel dials on there as well. Very classic. I would say that the only change that I would make to those is to do away with the Seamaster logo type at the bottom of the dial. But otherwise, a handsome throwback to the Omegas of old, with the best of Omega's modern technology ticking away under the hood.
I like the design choices they've made for these dials. I'm bigger fan of the Speedmaster than the Seamaster sort of aesthetic, but I still think they've done a great job on these, and I think these are good. Unlike some, I find so many pieces that people make for things like the Olympics tend to be kind of kitschy, and they tend to the styling doesn't hold up very well. But I think these are going to be. I think these will hold up over time. They're certainly good looking watches.
Yeah, they're classic. I mean, I think they've probably got a few hundred potential buyers just in the Podium winners. Because I mean, if I took home a gold medal, or it was even a silver or bronze at the Olympics, and there's an opportunity to acquire one of these pieces for the year that I had won, I'd be sorely tempted to pick one up.
Oh, absolutely. I would certainly pick up one of these watches if I was in that position, and I would wear it. It's definitely a good looking watch.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what Omega pulls out at Basel in just a few weeks' time.